For the Toronto Star, I'm Brian Bradley, and this matters. It has been over 4 years since Angelo Musitano, a prominent member of the Musitano crime family, was gunned down in his watered-down driveway, triggering a mob war in Hamilton. Now, with the conclusion of the court case against the only person ever arrested and charged, the Hamilton Spectator released Trigger, a 5-part series with never-before-heard details of the homicide, the complex police investigation that followed, and the sophisticated inner workings of the mafia. Nicole O'Reilly wrote the series. She is a longtime crime reporter at the Spec, and she joins us today to tell us all about it. Nicole, thanks so much for being here.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
We've talked about the Musitanos on This Matters before. Can you remind our listeners about the family and why the murder of one was so significant?
The Musitanos are one of 3 traditional organized crime families in Hamilton. Pat and Angelo Musitano became known back in the 90s when they were involved in taking out Johnny Pops Papalia, who was the sort of superstar leader of the Papalia family, a larger-than-life figure known as the Enforcer. And that sort of set the stage for them being really well known. The Musitanos at the time were actually one of the sort of the smaller of the 3 families, but this really rose them to prominence. They ended up going to prison in a plea deal for another murder related to that one of Papalia's lieutenants in Niagara. However, when they got out, things were kind of quiet for a while. That is until Angelo Musitano was shot in his watered-down driveway.
Take us back to that day in 2017 when the investigation began. Tell us about the first details and what happened.
Yeah, so this was back in May 2017. We'd really heard very little from the Musitanos since they had been released from prison. Angelo Musitano had sort of quietly moved into Waterdown. Neighbors didn't even know that he was sort of that Musitano. And suddenly, middle of day, kids coming home from school, middle of the afternoon, a killer pulls into the driveway just as Angelo's pulling in his truck and runs out and starts firing. And it's all captured on surveillance video. It shows that the killer was waiting in a car on the street. He is dressed head to toe, balaclava, dark clothing, gloves. He comes running out as Angelo pulls into the driveway and starts shooting at him in his car. His gun actually jams and he has to try to rack the gun. And so 3 unspent bullets were found by police on the ground after. And Angelo doesn't even get a chance to get out of his vehicle. He's shot right through the driver's side window. And you can see him sort of flailing around in the vehicle as this happens. And then the shooter runs away. And seconds later, his wife comes out and is sort of looking confused at first. And then she realizes what's going on and runs back in to get a phone and actually ends up, while she's on 911, climbing in the vehicle. It's a pretty chilling video.
There are some theories about why Angelo was murdered. What are they?
When Angelo was first murdered, of course, everyone immediately was talking about the murder from, 2 decades before of Johnny Pops Papalia and questioning whether it could be revenge. And there's a saying, that the mob never forgets or the mafia never forgets. And it's very true. So could that have played a role in what happened? Possibly. The idea that maybe back when those murders happened, that they would have been protected somehow, perhaps by Vito Rizzuto in Montreal or some other powerful figure, and that maybe they lost that protection over time. That's a big factor. It also could have been very much, just because things were quiet doesn't mean that the mafia stops operating. Business continues. They're in the business of extortion and drugs and, all that kind of stuff. So it's very possible that it was related to some other more recent power play, or maybe a little bit of both, which is sort of where my thinking lies. I also think it's noteworthy that, Pat was the kingpin. Pat was the leader of the family. He was the mob boss, not Angelo. But Pat loved his little brother. He loved him more than anything, it seemed like. He never had kids of his own. He was married. And a sure way to really hurt Pat is to kill Angelo.
The initial investigation quickly revealed some key players, and you break it down really well in your story. Who were they?
Yeah, so interestingly, that very night after Angelo was murdered, the police towed his vehicle back to the station and they found a tracker on the car. And they started with that, and they started with surveillance, and they were able to figure out where the trackers were purchased, and they were able to find the account name that the trackers were purchased under and piece together videos and cell phone data and photos, even people in the neighborhood who had taken pictures of suspicious vehicles. And it was very clear that there was people involved in surveillance of Angelo and his family before the murder happened. And so they pretty quickly keyed in on 3 figures. One is Michael Cudmore, who was the first person. He bought the first tracker. The account was under his name. He is a very well-known, or was a very well-known sort of enforcer. He had lots of organized crime connections, a violent career criminal. He disappeared to Mexico shortly after Angelo's murder, and he was sort of in hiding in there for years. People speculated that he was dead. And then last summer, he was found murdered there in Mexico. He was the gunman. That's who police say was the gunman in the murder. Then the other two figures that were connected to was Daniel Tomasetti. He's an Ancaster guy, no criminal record, wasn't previously known to police. He was sort of the communications guy. He's the one who's captured on all the records, making the phone calls to other interesting organized crime figures. He's making calls to Mexico. He's making calls to New York, and he's making calls to known figures here in Hamilton. And he's captured on surveillance, driving the cars around, checking out spots beforehand, that kind of thing. I should mention that Daniel Tomasetti also fled to Mexico in the midst of the investigation. He's still wanted for first-degree murder. He's never been arrested. He's still presumably in hiding there. The third figure was Jabril Abdullah, who was actually a high school friend of Daniel Tomasetti's. And he's roped in when Daniel asks him to register vehicles in his name, and 2 vehicles are used in surveillance. He drove around some of the players during surveillance. He pleaded guilty last month to participating in a criminal organization. And he basically said that, he agreed to register the vehicles in his name and drive people around, but he didn't really know who he was working for. He had no idea of any murder plots, and that he was sort of like a low-level player, just in it for money, basically.
We'll be right back. Just mentioning trackers and registering vehicles sounds very sophisticated to me. Tell me about their steps leading up to the shooting.
It really was very sophisticated. Mob murders are very different than some other type of crimes. They're not spur of the moment. They're well planned. It's never the sort of the made mob guys, the actual mobsters who pull the trigger themselves. They hire other people to do it. And these are months of planning in the making. So, there's records that Daniel Tomasetti was asking Jabril Abdullah to register vehicles in his name in August 2016. So the Angelo's murder was in May of 2017. So in months in advance, Michael Cudmore rents an apartment in Hamilton. There have multiple vehicles involved in surveillance. They had 7 trackers that they bought in total. They had trackers on Pat Musitano's car, Angelo Musitano's car, Angelo's wife, Pat and Angelo's mother, their cousin. They were spending a lot of time and money following these guys around and really, meticulously planning it. And they knew Angelo's movements. They knew where he was. They would have been able to follow it in real time. These trackers are really sophisticated. You stick it under the bumper, and there's an app that you can download on your phone and actually watch in real time where the vehicles are moving. And interestingly, when they did the autopsy, stuffed in Angelo's jacket pocket was a note that had a driver's license plate of one of the vehicles that was involved in surveilling him. So he clearly had some suspicions that he was being followed, but I don't think he had any idea that there was a tracker on his or his wife or his brother's or his mom's vehicle.
That is absolutely chilling. Investigation followed, of course, but in January, a joint investigation was formed between Hamilton Police, York Police, and the RCMP. Why did they do that?
Yeah, so police had pretty quickly identified those 3 suspects, and they'd been following them around for some time. And what happened is one of the vehicles, actually the black Honda Civic, which is one of the vehicles that Jabril Abdullah had registered in his name, was captured on surveillance video near another murder. And they were able to piece together through this data that it's the same people involved in Angelo Musitano's murder were also involved in a botched hit that happened in Woodbridge a little over a month before. And that's where innocent bystander Mila Barberi was murdered. She was there to pick up her boyfriend, Severio Serrano, who is the son of Diego Serrano, who's a known organized crime figure out in that area. And police believe the true target was actually one of the Serranos. Severio Serrano was shot in the arm, but he managed to survive. But Mila, unfortunately, just 28 years old, a veterinary technician. Her family are loving, wonderful people who attended all of the court dates, the only family ones who were there. And she was the one who died. And police were able to connect the 2 murders because they said the same people were involved, the same vehicles were involved, and similar surveillance type techniques were being done, somewhat to a lesser extent on the Serranos than the Musitanos, but there was surveillance being done in that case also. And so they formed a joint investigation bringing together York, Hamilton, and RCMP because the conspiracy was sort of part of one big picture.
What transpired after that investigation was launched? As you lay out in your investigation, it all seems to happen very quickly.
Yeah. So pretty quickly, they find the trackers. They identify the people involved. They're following them. They're watching them. Michael Cudmore is already in Mexico. And so, they're watching Daniel Tomasetti and Jabril Abdullah for quite some time, sort of waiting for something to happen. They covertly search Michael Cudmore's apartment, thinking maybe he'll come back. We don't want him to know that we were here. And they're following them, and not really a lot is happening in the investigation. So then that's when it brings us to sort of January 2018. That's when they announce the Joint Forces Project. They start holding more press conferences and releasing more details to the public because they're really trying to push these guys into talking. They've got approval to listen to their phone calls. They've got trackers on their vehicles. And I think they're trying to find, are they talking to whoever ordered the hits, or is Michael Cudmore going to come back? They're trying to find the bigger players, right? And not a lot is happening. So they hold a press conference and they release images of some of the vehicles that were used in surveillance. And they did something kind of tricky, which was they said that they were looking to speak with owners of 2016 to 2011 black Honda Civics, which is kind of an absurd ask because there's probably a heck of a lot of those kind of vehicles. And I remember I was at the press conference and I said, that's a lot of cars. Like, you're really trying to find all those owners. And they kind of, we have a partial plate. They, and well, it turns out, no, they knew the license plate. They knew everything about this vehicle. They knew when Jabril Abdullah registered it in his name. They knew everything about it. What they wanted that to sort of spook them into action. So, a few days after that press conference, they actually met with Jabril Abdullah, the police did. Hamilton police, they met with him at a Tim Hortons, and they actually brought along like a fake questionnaire asking him about his black Honda Civic. Like, they knew everything about this vehicle already. And he said he sold it, which he had. And during that meeting, they asked him if he knew about the murder of Musitano and if he was there. And Jabril Abdullah replied that, I've never been to Waterdown, or I don't go to Waterdown. And they also showed him a picture of Michael Cudmore and asked if he recognized him. And Jabril Abdullah said something like, he looks kind of familiar. He might be a guy that I see at the gym, kind of thing. And that was it. And then what happens is a few days later, or later that month, is when Daniel Tomasetti flees and goes to Mexico himself. And it's after that that police start executing warrants and arresting people.
In July 2020, there is somewhat of a pinnacle event that all of this seemed to lead up to. What happened?
July 10th, 2020, Pat Musitano is murdered in a parking lot in Burlington. He had survived an attempt on his life when he was shot outside his lawyer's office in Mississauga the year previous. And he had been very quiet after then. He had left, after Angelo was murdered. You could still find him sitting sort of on the porch on his St. Clair Boulevard, Hamilton house. And he seemed to be very bold about it. After that attempt on his life, things were very quiet. He was seemingly in hiding. So we didn't really know much about where he was. I'd heard some rumors about where he may have been living. And he's coming into his vehicle and he shot and died in the parking lot right next to his armored vehicle, sort of seemingly ending the power that the Musitanos had.
Are there suspects in that shooting?
There's never been any suspects, to my knowledge, at least not that have been publicly named. It's a Halton police investigation, not a Hamilton one. It happened in Burlington, and no one's ever been charged.
You mentioned the Musitanos are one of 3 traditional crime families in Hamilton, and now that family is effectively silenced. Who are the other families we should be paying attention to?
So the 3 sort of traditional families going back decades were the Papalias, who I mentioned earlier, Johnny Pop's Papalia, and they've been silent basically since Johnny Pop's murder. There's the Musitanos, who are now effectively gone with the murder of Pat. And the final family was the Lupino Violis. So they're the ones who are still around, along with sort of some more recent figures. Angelo's murder really started a mob war. There was a lot of retaliatory violence back and forth, and the Lupino Violis weren't spared in that. JJ Lupino was murdered, who is the cousin of 2 really interesting figures who are Dom and Joey Violi. They're the son of Paolo Violi, who was a Montreal mobster, and their mother was a Lupino. And that's where you get the Lupino Violi family, a sort of a Montreal mobster and a traditional Lupino Hamilton family that married in with each other. And they're in prison right now, Dom and Joey Violi. They were brought down in an investigation, another Joint Forces investigation into drugs. What was interesting about that case is they actually had a turncoat, a mobster from New York who called up the RCMP and became an undercover agent. And he wore a wire and he secretly recorded conversations with them. So that evidence was never tested in court because Dom and Joey both pleaded guilty. But the evidence from the wire transcripts is really interesting because while this wire is running, all these murders are happening. So you hear them talking about Angelo's murder. There's them talking about, Pat will be dead by Christmas. They're talking about other figures. They're talking about Tony Ibarone's name comes up, and Tony Ibarone's name also comes up during the Musitano case because he's one of the people that Daniel Tomasetti is calling. And interestingly, during the mob war, his own younger brother ends up being murdered in a very similar style to Angelo Musitano. So you're seeing this sort of back and forth retaliatory violence, and often seeing some weaker players targeted too, the cousin or the nephew or the brother, sort of to hurt the more powerful people. Anyways, Dom and Joey Violi are still in prison for this drug trafficking case. But of the three sort of traditional organized crime families in Hamilton, to me, they're the most sort of interesting ones to watch in the future because they're still at play. And one of the most interesting things that was captured on the wire during the investigation that brought them down the drug trafficking case was Dom Violi actually said that he was made the underboss of the Buffalo mob, which is, New York has like the traditional 5 families. And there's never been a Canadian named to that second highest position in the mob. Again, it was never tested in court, but there's no reason to doubt him. He didn't know that he was being recorded at this time. When he was sentenced, actually, he got a standing ovation in court, which sort of tells you, and you had all these community members showing up to pay respect for him. So in my opinion, I think watching the Lupino Violas will be the most interesting thing to watch in the future.
That is fascinating. That's actually my last question for you. The Musitanos are dead, and a handful of their other associates and enemies have been killed or jailed. Where are we now? What can we expect?
The Musitanos, maybe there's some allies out there, but I think, Pat's gone, Angelo's gone. There's not really much of a future there. But does that mean that things go quiet? No, absolutely not. Even when things are quiet, that just means that there's a balance of power, right? The mob will always continue to operate, and there will always eventually be some sort of power play. So, could there be more violence? Yes, absolutely. But there also probably is a lot of other criminal activity ongoing that we don't know about. And certainly, as I mentioned, the Lupino Violi family is an interesting one for me to watch. And there's also some sort of newer emerging figures, like I mentioned, Tony Ibarone. And I've heard from sources that he's grown in power. So it'll be interesting to see sort of what happens.
Thanks for sharing all this with us, Nicole.
No problem.
Nicole O'Reilly is a crime reporter for the Hamilton Spectator. That's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. I'm your host, Brian Bradley. Our This Matters team is Adrian Chung, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bachneck, Raju Mutter, Saba Itazas, and Sean Pattenden. Our music is by So Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattenden. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star Newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.